Marine Sergeant Elena Rodriguez had always been underestimated. Standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall with a quiet demeanor, she blended into crowds easily. Her fellow Marines knew her as a reliable communications specialist, someone who kept her head down and did her job without complaint. What they didn't know was that Elena had grown up hunting in the mountains of Montana, where her grandfather had taught her to shoot before she could properly tie her shoes. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the Afghan mountainside as Elena adjusted her radio equipment. Alpha Team, composed of 8 Navy SEALs, had been inserted into the region 3 days earlier to gather intelligence on a high-value target. Elena was there as their communications link to base, a role she had performed dozens of times before. The SEALs treated her with professional respect, but she could see it in their eyes. They viewed her as support personnel, not a warrior. Team leader Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison checked his watch for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. The mission had been going smoothly until their Afghan interpreter had spotted movement in the valley below. Through their scopes, they could see a convoy of vehicles approaching the village they were monitoring. Morrison made the decision to move closer for a better view, despite Elena's subtle suggestion that they maintain their current position. The team descended through rocky terrain, with Elena following at the rear, her radio pack bouncing against her back. She had learned long ago not to voice her tactical concerns too loudly. The SEALs were elite operators, and she was just the comms girl. But something felt wrong about this movement. The hair on the back of her neck stood up as they took position behind a low stone wall overlooking the village. Morrison whispered into his headset, relaying their new position to command. Elena set up her radio equipment efficiently, her trained eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Years of hunting had taught her to notice when the natural rhythm of an environment changed. The birds had stopped singing. Even the insects seemed quieter. These were signs her grandfather had taught her to recognize, signs that predators were near. The convoy below consisted of 5 vehicles, more than they had been expecting. Elena counted at least 20 armed fighters, all carrying weapons that looked far more sophisticated than the usual Taliban equipment. Through her binoculars, she noticed something that made her stomach drop. These weren't local fighters. Their gear, their formation, their discipline, everything screamed foreign training. One of the SEALs, Petty Officer Davis, chuckled quietly as he watched the convoy through his scope. "Looks like we hit the jackpot, boys. Command's going to love this intel." Elena wanted to tell him to keep his voice down, but protocol kept her silent. She wasn't combat personnel, after all. Morrison was busy photographing the vehicles and fighters when Elena noticed the sun glinting off something in the hills across from them. Her hunting instincts kicked in immediately. She had seen that same glint countless times when other hunters were positioned on distant ridges. Someone was watching them through a scope. Elena tapped Morrison on the shoulder and pointed toward the opposite hillside. "Sir, I think we have company," she whispered. Morrison followed her gaze but saw nothing. The glint had disappeared. "Negative, Rodriguez. Just focus on maintaining comms." His dismissal stung, but Elena knew better than to argue. Minutes passed in tense silence as the team continued their surveillance. Elena's unease grew stronger with each passing moment. She had learned to trust her instincts in the wilderness, and right now every instinct was screaming danger. She began mentally calculating distances and angles, a habit from her hunting days that had become second nature. The attack came without warning. The first shot struck the stone wall inches from Morrison's head, sending chips of rock flying. "Contact!" he shouted, but his words were drowned out by the sudden eruption of gunfire from multiple positions. Elena dove for cover as bullets whined overhead, her heart pounding against her ribs. The SEALs immediately returned fire, their training taking over. But Elena could see what they couldn't from their positions. The enemy had them surrounded on 3 sides, with at least 30 fighters positioned in a horseshoe formation around their location. The team was trapped, with nowhere to retreat except down into the village where more enemies waited. Petty Officer Chen took a bullet in the shoulder and rolled behind cover, grimacing in pain. The team's medic, Hospital Corpsman Martinez, crawled over to treat him while bullets continued to rain down on their position. Elena pressed herself against the stone wall, her mind racing through options none of the others could see. Morrison tried to call for air support, but Elena could hear the frustration in his voice as he spoke into his radio. The nearest aircraft was 20 minutes out, and they didn't have 20 minutes. At their current rate of ammunition expenditure, they would be out of bullets in less than 10 minutes. The enemy knew this and was content to keep them pinned down until they ran dry. Elena's grandfather had always told her that the best hunters weren't the strongest or the fastest. They were the ones who could think clearly when everything went wrong. As she listened to the steady drum of enemy fire, Elena realized that her teammates couldn't see the full tactical picture from their low positions. But she could. During a brief lull in the firing, Elena crawled over to Morrison. "Sir, I need to move to higher ground to get better comm signal," she said, gesturing toward a rocky outcropping about 50 yards up the slope behind them. It wasn't entirely a lie. The radio would work better from there. But more importantly, it would give her the angle she needed. Morrison barely looked at her, focused on coordinating their defense. "Do what you need to do, Rodriguez. Just keep us connected to base." He had no idea what she was really planning. None of them did. Elena began her careful crawl up the slope, keeping low as bullets continued to whistle overhead. Her radio pack felt heavier than usual, but that was because of what else she was carrying. Concealed beneath her communication equipment was something the SEALs had never seen her use in combat, a custom rifle her grandfather had built for her years ago. As she reached the rocky outcropping, Elena could finally see the entire battlefield spread out below her. The enemy positions were clearly visible now, and she began counting targets and calculating distances. The nearest enemy fighter was about 400 yards away. The furthest was just over 600 yards. For most people, these would be impossible shots under combat conditions. But Elena Rodriguez wasn't most people. Elena quickly assembled her rifle with practiced movements her grandfather had drilled into her thousands of times. The weapon was a modified Remington 700 that he had customized for long-range precision shooting. She had carried it on every deployment, telling anyone who asked that it was specialized communication equipment. The SEALs had never questioned it, assuming it was some kind of technical gear they weren't familiar with. She pressed her eye to the scope and immediately identified her first target, an enemy sniper positioned on a ridge about 500 yards away. He was the one responsible for keeping the SEALs pinned down, and eliminating him would give the team room to maneuver. Elena controlled her breathing exactly as her grandfather had taught her, waiting for the natural pause between heartbeats. The shot rang out across the valley, and the enemy sniper jerked backward before disappearing behind the rocks. Elena had already moved to acquire her second target before the first man hit the ground. A machine gunner was set up behind a boulder 400 yards to the east, his weapon spitting fire at the pinned SEALs below. Elena adjusted for wind and distance, her movements automatic after years of practice. The second shot found its mark, silencing the machine gun immediately. Down below, she could hear Morrison shouting questions about where the covering fire was coming from, but there was no time to explain. She had 8 more targets to eliminate before the enemy figured out where she was shooting from. The third target was the most challenging. An enemy commander positioned 600 yards away, partially concealed behind a truck. Elena had to wait for him to expose himself enough to guarantee a clean shot. When he finally stepped out to signal his fighters, she was ready. The bullet struck him center mass, and she watched through her scope as the enemy fighters around him began to panic. Elena shifted position slightly, moving behind a different rock formation to avoid detection. Her fourth target was already in her sights, another machine gunner who had been raking the SEAL's position with devastating fire. This shot was at a slightly downward angle, requiring her to compensate for gravity as well as wind. The bullet dropped the gunner instantly, his weapon falling silent. By now, the enemy fighters below were beginning to realize they were being picked off by an unseen marksman. Elena could see them pointing in various directions, trying to locate the source of the precise shots that were systematically destroying their positions. Their confusion was exactly what she needed to continue her work. Target number 5 was a fighter with an RPG who had been moving into position to destroy the stone wall protecting the seals. Elena tracked him through her scope as he ran between cover points, waiting for the moment when he would pause to aim his weapon. When he finally stopped and shouldered the RPG, Elena's bullet found him before he could pull the trigger. The 6th target required Elena to completely change her position. An enemy fighter had flanked around to the north and was moving to cut off any potential escape route for the SEAL team. Elena low-crawled across 30 yards of exposed ground to get an angle on him. The movement was risky, but necessary. When she finally had a clear shot, the distance was just over 400 yards through a gap between two boulders. Elena's training kicked in as she controlled her breathing and squeezed the trigger. The fighter dropped immediately, his weapon clattering down the rocky slope. 6 targets eliminated, and the enemy was beginning to lose their cohesion. She could hear shouting in multiple languages as the remaining fighters tried to understand what was happening to their carefully planned ambush. Target 7 was another sniper who had finally figured out the general direction Elena's shots were coming from. She could see him scanning the hillside through his scope, searching for her position. This shot would be the most dangerous. If she missed or only wounded him, he would immediately return fire and potentially end her ability to help the trapped SEALs. Elena took extra time with this shot, accounting for every variable she could identify. The wind had shifted slightly, and she adjusted her aim accordingly. When she fired, she watched through her scope as the enemy sniper's rifle spun away from him, the man collapsing backward out of sight. 7 down, 3 to go. The 8th target was moving, sprinting between cover points as he tried to reach a better firing position. Elena had to lead him like a running deer, predicting where he would be when her bullet arrived. She fired just as he dove for cover behind a large rock. For a moment she thought she had missed, but then she saw blood on the stone where he had been trying to take cover. Down below, Elena could hear the change in the SEALs' voices. The overwhelming enemy fire that had kept them pinned down was now reduced to sporadic shots from the remaining fighters. Morrison was shouting orders to advance. But Elena knew her job wasn't finished yet. 2 more targets remained, and they were the most dangerous. Target number 9 was the enemy's second-in-command, a man who was trying to rally the remaining fighters for a final assault on the SEAL position. Elena could see him gesturing wildly, pointing toward the stone wall where her teammates were sheltered. He was 550 yards away, partially concealed by a disabled vehicle. Elena waited patiently for her opportunity. The man kept ducking behind the vehicle, only exposing himself for seconds at a time. When he finally stepped out to wave his fighters forward, Elena was ready. Her shot dropped him instantly, and she watched as the remaining enemy fighters began to lose their will to fight. The 10th and final target was the most personal. Through her scope, Elena could see the fighter who had wounded Petty Officer Chen at the beginning of the ambush. He was now trying to escape, running down the hillside toward the village below. The range was extreme, nearly 700 yards, and the target was moving fast across uneven terrain. Elena took a deep breath and made her calculations. She would have to lead the running figure significantly, accounting for his speed, the downward angle, and the distance involved. This was the kind of shot her grandfather had made her practice hundreds of times on running game animals, but never under combat conditions with her teammates' lives hanging in the balance. She fired her final shot just as the fighter reached a small clearing in his descent. Through her scope, she watched him stumble and fall, disappearing into the rocky terrain. 10 targets eliminated in exactly 18 minutes, though the SEALs below had no idea who their guardian angel had been. Elena quickly disassembled her rifle and secured it back in her equipment pack. By the time she crawled down to rejoin the team, they were already moving forward to secure the area. Morrison looked at her with confusion as she appeared beside him with her radio equipment. "Rodriguez, where the hell did that sniper support come from? Command didn't mention any Overwatch assets in this area." Elena shrugged and adjusted her radio pack. "Maybe it was that Afghan Special Forces unit operating in the next valley over, sir. Good timing for us." Morrison nodded, accepting her explanation without question. It never occurred to him that their quiet communications specialist could have been responsible for the precision shooting that had just saved all their lives. 3 months later, Elena found herself sitting in a secure briefing room at Camp Leatherneck, facing a panel of officers she had never seen before. The investigation had been thorough and discreet, triggered by inconsistencies in the after-action reports from the ambush. Someone had noticed that the mysterious sniper support mentioned in the SEAL's report didn't match any friendly units known to be operating in that area. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, a stern woman with graying hair and penetrating eyes, opened a thick file and spread several photographs across the table. They were high-resolution images taken by military satellites, showing the hillside where Elena had positioned herself during the firefight. In one of them, Elena could clearly see her own figure behind the rocky outcropping, her rifle assembled and ready. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Colonel Mitchell began, her voice calm but carrying an undertone of authority that made Elena sit straighter in her chair. "We've been conducting a detailed analysis of the engagement that occurred 3 months ago. The ballistics reports are quite interesting. 10 enemy fighters eliminated by 10 shots fired from a single position over an 18-minute period." Elena maintained her composure, keeping her expression neutral despite her racing heart. She had known this moment would come eventually. Military investigations were thorough, and satellite coverage of combat zones meant that very little escaped notice. She simply nodded and waited for the colonel to continue. The second officer, a Navy captain whose nameplate read Harrison, leaned forward and pointed to one of the photographs. "The trajectory analysis shows that all 10 shots came from this exact position, where our satellite imagery clearly shows you, Sergeant Rodriguez, with what appears to be a precision rifle that doesn't match any standard military-issue weapon." Elena had rehearsed this moment in her mind countless times. She could deny everything, claim the photographs were unclear, insist that there must have been another sniper in the area. But looking at the clear evidence spread before her, she knew that lying would only make things worse. Her grandfather had always taught her that honor meant accepting responsibility for her actions. "Yes, ma'am," Elena said quietly. "That was me." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a fired rifle. The 3 officers exchanged glances, and Elena could see a mixture of surprise and respect in their expressions. They had been expecting denials and evasions, not a straightforward confession. Colonel Mitchell leaned back in her chair and studied Elena carefully. "Sergeant, do you understand the implications of what you just admitted? You engaged enemy targets with an unauthorized weapon in a role you were not assigned to perform without orders from your commanding officer. These are serious violations of military protocol." Elena nodded again, accepting the weight of her actions. "Yes, ma'am, I understand. But my teammates were going to die if someone didn't act. The enemy had us surrounded and outnumbered. Air support was 20 minutes out, and we didn't have 20 minutes. I did what I had to do to bring everyone home." The third officer, an Army major named Thompson, opened another file and began reading. "According to your service record, Sergeant Rodriguez, you're listed as a communications specialist with no formal sniper training. Yet the precision demonstrated in this engagement rivals that of our most elite marksmen. How do you explain this discrepancy?" For the first time since the interrogation began, Elena allowed herself a small smile. My grandfather, sir. He was a hunter and a veteran of Vietnam. He started teaching me to shoot when I was 6 years old. By the time I was 12, I could consistently hit targets at 600 yards. I've been practicing long-range shooting my entire life. Captain Harrison looked intrigued. And the rifle? Our weapons experts have examined the ballistics evidence. The bullets came from a highly modified precision weapon, not standard military issue. Where did you acquire this weapon? Elena's voice softened as she spoke about her grandfather. He built it for me, sir. It's a modified Remington 700 with a custom barrel and trigger system. He gave it to me when I enlisted, told me it might save my life someday. I've carried it on every deployment, registered it properly with the armory, but listed it as specialized communications equipment. The room fell silent as the officers processed her words. Elena could see them struggling to reconcile the quiet, unassuming woman sitting before them with the lethal precision she had demonstrated on that Afghan hillside. Finally, Colonel Mitchell spoke again, her tone noticeably warmer. Sergeant Rodriguez, what you did was technically against regulations. However, your actions saved the lives of 8 Navy SEALs and prevented a significant intelligence asset from being compromised. The enemy forces you eliminated were later identified as foreign fighters with connections to multiple terrorist organizations. Your intervention disrupted a planned series of attacks against coalition forces. Elena felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she remained at attention. She had learned long ago that military situations could change rapidly, and she wasn't out of trouble yet. Captain Harrison opened yet another file and began reading from it. We've spent the last 3 months conducting background investigations and reviewing your entire service record, Sergeant. What we found was remarkable. You've been present at 4 separate engagements over the past 2 years where enemy snipers were mysteriously eliminated by unknown marksmen. In each case, you were nearby as a communications specialist. Elena's stomach dropped. She had hoped that those incidents had gone unnoticed, that her activities had been attributed to other friendly forces in the area. Apparently, military intelligence was more thorough than she had given them credit for. She waited for the hammer to fall. Major Thompson stood up and walked around the table until he was standing directly in front of Elena. Sergeant Rodriguez, effective immediately, you are being transferred to a classified unit that specializes in long-range reconnaissance and elimination of high-value targets. Your new commanding officer will brief you on your duties once you arrive at your new assignment. Elena blinked in surprise, certain she had misheard. Sir, I don't understand. Am I being court-martialed or reassigned? Colonel Mitchell stood as well, extending her hand to Elena with a genuine smile. Congratulations, Sergeant. You're being promoted to Staff Sergeant and assigned to one of the military's most elite units. It seems your unique skills have been wasted in communications. As Elena shook the colonel's hand, she thought about the SEALs, who still had no idea that their quiet communications specialist had saved their lives that day in Afghanistan. Lieutenant Commander Morrison had submitted her for a commendation for maintaining communications under fire, never suspecting the truth about what had really happened on that hillside. 6 months later, Staff Sergeant Elena Rodriguez stood on a different hillside in a different country, her grandfather's rifle assembled and ready. This time, however, she wasn't hiding her abilities from anyone. Her new teammates knew exactly who she was and what she could do. The quiet girl who had spent years being underestimated was finally where she belonged. Elena pressed her eye to the scope and began her scan of the target area below. Her grandfather had always told her that the best hunters were patient, that they waited for the perfect shot rather than rushing into action. As she settled into her position and controlled her breathing, Elena smiled slightly. Her grandfather would have been proud to know that his lessons had not only saved her own life, but the lives of countless others who would never know her name. The mission briefing had been clear: eliminate the high-value target and extract without detection. For most snipers, it would be a challenging assignment. For Elena Rodriguez, it was just another day at work. The girl who had grown up hunting in the mountains of Montana had finally found her true calling, and she was very, very good at it.